Today we're going to take this old rocking chair and we're going to give it a deep red mahogany finish. So here's the story behind this chair. Nicole comes to me about a year ago and says, here's this beat up old chair, it's my mom's, it used to belong to my grandmom, and it's something we want to keep in the family. Can you fix it? Well, of course, it was pretty much totaled. Pieces were falling off, there were legs that were broken. This thing needed a lot of work, but hey, it's a family heirloom, right? So I want to make it look good and I want to make sure it's actually functional for the family. Well, come to find out, it was actually just a flea market find that my mother-in-law really likes. Still, that's a good enough reason to do it, but it kind of changes the story a little bit. Either way, it was time to get to the project. That was about a year ago, so you guys know how that goes. Sometimes these projects sit around and you just don't get a chance to get to them. Well, the chair has been repaired. That's not really the point of this video. In fact, I wasn't going to cover this at all in a video, but once I got to the finish, I realized there was some really valuable information here that I know you guys would appreciate. This looks to be some type of mahogany. There are some mahogany-like woods that kind of confuse me and I have a hard time telling them apart, especially if it's a foreign-made chair. This one, I really don't know what the history of it is. I took off all the upholstering and everything that was on there, just got it down to the wood frame, and it's a very mahogany-like wood. I can't honestly say whether it is or not, but it really doesn't matter because the finish that we're going to give it is going to be so deep and rich, it will actually mask a good amount of the grain. That was the type of finish that was on here before, and I'm going to replicate that. So let me show you some of the details of the finishes we're going to use and how we're going to approach it. Now, a really deep, rich red mahogany finish can be kind of tricky to get to, and it really depends on the type of wood that you're starting with. If you want to try and make maple or poplar or something that really isn't even close to that look, if you want to try and make that look like a red mahogany finish or a deep cherry finish, that's a little bit more of a challenge. That's a big color shift. But if you're starting with something like mahogany, for instance, or whatever this chair happens to be made out of, it tends to be a little bit easier because it already has reds and browns in it. You just need to enhance those, and that's what we're going to do today. But still, even then, it's a two-part process because a lot of times it's difficult to find the perfect finish that has both all the red and all the brown that I want. So a lot of times I like to do it in two steps. And to tell you the truth, there must be thousands of combinations of things that we can do, different types of finishes, whether it's water-based or oil-based, gel stains versus dyes, whatever you want to use, you can do it 100 different ways, 1,000 different ways. What I am going to do today is basically just pulled a couple things out of the finish cabinet, and I'm going to use a combination of, first of all, one coat of a dye stain, which is going to bring most of the red to the party. It's a Merlot General Finishes water-based dye. That's going to give it a really deep, rich red color, but quite a bit more red than I really want. But that's the undertone that we're going for. On top of that, I'm going to use an oil-based gel stain, which is brown mahogany. The brown mahogany is a little bit too brown. I don't have enough red undertones. So when you use these together, it actually makes a really beautiful finish. So I have a piece of mahogany here that I'm using as a test. And what I've got, okay, this is just plain mahogany here. You can see the colors. This is the brown mahogany gel stain alone. Behind this, ignore this middle section here, but this is the Merlot water-based dye. And right here is where I let the water-based dye dry and I use the brown mahogany gel stain on top of the red Merlot color. And you can see that actually brings me exactly where I want to be. The other advantage here is this is an old chair. The chair is dinged up. I've sanded it pretty decent. The problem is you're never going to get all those dents out. And in fact, that kind of removes some of the charm. It's an older piece. It shouldn't look brand new. And we're going to give it an upholstery job that's going to make it look like it came from the time when it was originally made. So trying to get all those dents and everything really removes all the character. So I'm going to leave them in there, but I do want to even out some of the flaws on the surface if there's little black marks or things that I just couldn't sand out. So a gel stain is perfect for that because I could very carefully blend it in and just get a nice even color over the whole chair, and gel stains kind of stay on the surface and don't necessarily absorb as deeply, so you can push the color around a little bit and get a really, really nice, deep, rich color that you're looking for, and a little bit of that grain masking that we were talking about. And that's really it, 2 hand-applied finishes. I could go the route of spraying dyes and doing multiple coats, maybe putting a little bit of pigment into some lacquer or something and creating a toner. perfectly legitimate way to go, and in fact might even be a faster way to go. But what I wanted to show you, because I know most of you guys don't necessarily have HVLP systems and don't have the means to spray, a nice hand-applied version of this finish, which I think is perfectly acceptable. So at this point, what I'm going to do is grab a spray bottle of water, I'm going to spray the whole thing down, let it dry, and I want to pre-raise that grain. Because I have a oops, that's the oil. I have a water-based dye here. When that dye hits the surface, the water swells the wood fibers, and we're going to get a really rough surface that's going to have to be sanded. We don't want to do that if there's dye in the mix. So we pre-raise the grain by spraying it down with water, let it dry for an hour or so, then come back, sand it lightly with 220, 180 grit, and then we can start applying our stains. So let's get to it. Now in the literature, you'll see most people recommend using distilled water for this purpose. You can buy that at the grocery store in gallons. You know, and I guess the idea is you want to avoid any excess minerals or anything being in the water that could cause staining on the surface of the wood. You know, honestly, I've never really had a problem with that, so I'm just using tap water here, but if you do any test boards and hit it with your regular tap water and you notice that there's some black spotting or some issues developing, you definitely want to go with distilled. So after the pre-raising, I sanded everything nice and smooth again, and we're ready to apply the dye. Now with dye, once it hits the surface of the wood, that wood is like a sponge. It pulls that dye, the moisture, and the color into the fibers. And sometimes it can be a little bit too aggressive, and you can end up with a little bit of unevenness. So what I like to do is take that same spray bottle of water, and I spray the wood ahead of time with a light mist. And what that does is it lets the wood soak in clear water first, and then once I apply the dye, I'll have a little bit more working time to push the color around because the wood isn't so thirsty. It's already picked up some moisture from the water. So let's go ahead and start applying some color. Just using a cotton scrap of t-shirt material here. Just wipe it into the surface. And you can see it's a little excessive in terms of the red color, but that's all right because it's an undertone. And once it's dry, it'll lighten up a little bit. So I'm just going to follow the same process over the entire piece. Now as I apply the dye to the last part of the chair here, you'll notice over the rest of it as the dye starts to dry, it takes on a little bit of a lighter tone, but the deep rich color will come back once you put some finish on it. So we're not too worried about that. What we're really concerned about is creating a deep undertone. Now this is kind of a weird story, but it's one that sort of taught me a lesson about deep rich layering of color and how you can only get that with layers as opposed to one color hitting it at once. When I went and got my first tattoo, I was 18 years old, and I saw a few pictures of tattoos in a little photo album that the guy had there. And I saw this one amazing tattoo, it just looked like nothing I'd ever seen before that would be possible on skin. And it was just, the color was amazing, it's really hard to describe, and I said, that's what I want. I said, that just has so much depth to it, it's amazing. And the guy said, you can't have that. And I was like, well, why not? He said the person who had this done covered up another tattoo. So what they were showing was the depth of multiple colors being layered. And he said, you know, technically if you want to go have a tattoo and then have it relayered over, we might be able to work something like that out. But the reason this thing looks the way it does is because there's layers of color and design built into it. So it's almost an accidental thing in that instance. But here, we're sort of relying on a similar concept. We have the original light brown, medium brown tone of the wood. It's getting hit with something that seems like an excessive amount of red. It's that Merlot red, which almost has a purple, pinkish quality to it. which in and of itself, I'm not sure that this would go over very well. But once we hit it with that final coat of brown on top, when you layer those colors together, the end result is something that's absolutely stunning, but we might not have necessarily been able to hit that with one coat of a single color. Now you also might notice that there are some areas that I haven't hit on the insides here. This whole middle section is upholstered, so whether or not it gets hit with color really doesn't matter all that much. I'll hit it with a little bit, but I'm not too concerned about it. And one other thing I wanted to point out, as you're applying the dye, a lot of times you'll do one face and you may not get back to this section here until after you've done some other parts and this is dried. So you may get some edges where the color looks like it's a little heavy right around the edge. Well, here's the great thing, this is water-based dye. Just take your rag and just rub harder and it will even that color out. And if you're really having a hard time with it, just spray it with some water and that'll dilute it down, wipe it down, and you'll get a nice even surface when it's all said and done. Okay, so the water-based dye is nice and dry and I'm ready to apply the gel stain. What I have here is a little Gladware type plastic container with just a little bit of mineral spirits in there. And I like to dilute my gel stains just a little bit, not too much, because if you go too far, you're defeating the purpose of using a gel stain. So just a little bit to loosen it up, and it gives me a little bit more working time with the gel stain. So here's my application strategy. Got a nice clean rag here, well, sort of clean. It's got a little bit of the dye from my gloves. And I will apply a nice liberal coat. So while it's still wet, I want to wipe off the excess. And you notice I stopped where the grain changes direction. And as long as you move quickly, you don't have to be too careful about it. But the clean rag, or in this case, an old smelly sock, is good to wipe off all that excess and then go back to the wet application. Okay, now I'm going to try and get this whole vertical piece in one shot here. And don't be afraid of putting too much on. Basically, you want the surface to pick up as much as it can on its own. And you come back with the clean rag and you wipe off the excess. And that way, the wood will evenly take up what it's going to take up. If you're very, very stingy with your stain and you're just trying to make it last longer and rubbing really hard into the wood, you're going to wind up with an uneven staining when it's all said and done, which you do not want. So okay, and then basically, once I finish one section, I look for the spots that I've just touched because those are the ones that I want to do next. I don't want that little bit of extra material here. I really don't want that to dry before I apply stain to the rest of that piece because it could wind up leaving a mark. So let's move right along. Okay, and now back with the clean rag. Wipe off all of that excess. Now I'm just going to do this entire chair using the same exact process, doing, one piece at a time like this, and then wiping off the excess. Before you know it, we will be done. Now I told you that one of the great things about gel stain is that you can use it to hide flaws and selectively add a little bit more color in one area than another. So right here, this is a location of one of my epoxy repairs, and you can see there's a little bit of a light spot right in here. So I'm going to use just a little bit of extra stain in that area to disguise it. So I basically just dabbed on a whole schmutz load here, and then I'm going to just slowly wipe across to distribute it. So it's relatively heavy here and tapers off on the rest of it. And once this dries, it's very, very hard to detect that. Okay, but the way we do that is by using something that, for the most part, masks the grain. Now I'm going to let this dry overnight. If you're not happy with the color, you can always add another coat. But resist the urge to add another coat now. If you do, you can actually wind up pulling up a lot of that color that we just put down, and you can get some really nasty finishing issues with that if you try to reapply it before it's fully cured. So just let this dry tomorrow, the next day, check it out. See if you like the color. If you do, good, you can apply a top coat. If not, you could always add another coat of the gel stain at that point. I think we got really good coverage here. I think we're going to be able to proceed right away with our top coat. So now it's a few days later, and I've applied about 5 coats of a beautiful satin lacquer over the entire chair. And you can see this area still doesn't look that great, but it's going to be covered with the upholstery. Everything that matters looks really, really nice. And the finish is pretty much everything I expected it to be. There's quite a bit of grain masking, but that's how it was on the original. And those 2 different layers of color really got the effect that I wanted to. And a lot of people overthink the process to achieve a finish like this, and they're using glazes and things like that. There's nothing wrong with those methods, but sometimes it's just not really that necessary. You can do it with fewer steps. So the finish that I used was a lacquer that was done via HVLP, and I apologize for not showing it to you guys, but the last time I filmed myself spraying, I got a bunch of water-based finish on the lens. Fortunately, it cleaned off very easily. I'm not 100% sure how well a nitrocellulose lacquer is going to come off if that happens to get on the lens. So at some point in the future, I'll figure out a better way to do it. Maybe when I have a nice hood set up or something and there's no fumes coming toward the camera, I know that it won't get on the lens. But for now, since I spray outside in the driveway, the overspray gets everywhere and I just don't trust it. Now, the finish that I used was a can of Frazee clear satin lacquer. That's all it says, and it's about all the information I could find on it. Frazee was the closest place to me. I usually use Sherwin-Williams when I buy my gallons. And I went in and said, "You guys have lacquer?" And the guy said, he said, "What color?" I said, "Preferably clear." And he pointed me to a couple dusty cans of this stuff sitting on the shelf. And I said, "You know, what kind of lacquer is that offhand?" And he said, "Oh, it's satin." So that was very helpful. I assume that it's just the regular nitrocellulose lacquer. Certainly applies that way. I don't see any indication that it's anything else. Usually what I use is a cab acrylic lacquer from Sherwin-Williams, which is a really nice product, but they didn't have any at my local Sherwin-Williams. Now, speaking of overspray, spraying a piece like this, especially outside when there's no specific flow, if you're in front of a hood, all the overspray is usually pulled toward the hood, and it makes it a little bit more cleaner to apply. So what happens when the overspray tends to go everywhere, it gets on all of the parts that you're not directly spraying. And what it winds up doing is creating a little bit of a rough finish. So I applied about 4 coats that way, sanding in between with 600 grit wet dry paper. And the final coat, what I do is thin it pretty significantly using lacquer thinner. Probably about 75% lacquer thinner and maybe 25% of a lacquer. The idea is to apply a very thin coat that doesn't contain much varnish, because the lacquer thinner overspray doesn't really cause as much of a problem. The thinner just kind of hits the surface, absorbs, and it's not as much of an issue. So I like to apply a very light and thin coat. I lower the air pressure so it's minimal overspray, and then I go over the whole surface, and it usually leaves me with a nice finish, and any random overspray doesn't really affect the rest of the parts. So this is the final product. I think it's going to make my mother-in-law pretty happy, and at this point we just need to contact the upholsterer and get that upholstery work done. So I hope you learned something with this. It was just a random little tidbit that I wanted to share with you, but time to move on to bigger and better projects. Thanks for watching.